The Vethkai called it a bodyguard contract. Ambassador Sarah Voss called it a necessary indignity. Her chief of staff called it suicide, then tendered his resignation, then withdrew it when she reminded him that resignation was not a concept recognized under the Compact's employment statutes. The human's name was Marcus Reyes. He arrived on the station dock with a duffel bag, a faded scar running from his left ear to his jaw, and the particular stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago that moving unnecessarily was how people got killed. He was not large by human standards. Sarah had researched this, had pulled every biological record the Compact's Xenology division kept on Terran physiology. Medium height, medium build. The kind of body built for repetition rather than spectacle. He looked at the dock crew, looked at the shuttle that would carry them to the Halos archipelago, looked at Sarah with her 4 eyes and her diplomat's sash and her retinue of 7 Vethkai aides who were all clearly and visibly unhappy about him, and he said, "You're the client." It was not a question. "I am Ambassador Sarah Voss of the Compact's 3rd diplomatic tier," she said, because that was how she had always introduced herself. "Ambassador," he said, and that was the end of it. He picked up his duffel, walked to the shuttle, sat in the rearmost seat where he could see every entrance, and did not speak again until they were 40 minutes into the flight. Then he said, "Brief me on the threat." She had prepared for this. She had spent 11 days preparing for this, because the threat was not simple, and it was not the kind of thing that translated cleanly across species. She pulled up the data tablet and began. The Halos archipelago was a chain of volcanic islands in the equatorial belt of Verath 4, a world the Compact had been attempting to bring into the fold for the better part of 6 decades. Verath 4 was not a member world. It was not even a candidate world, not officially. Officially, it was a contested zone, which was a diplomatic phrase that meant something had gone wrong here, and we are not sure yet whose fault it is. What had gone wrong was the Dravith. The Dravith, Sarah said, watching the human's face carefully, are a precontact species. They evolved in the deep ocean trenches of Verath 4 approximately 40 million years before your species learned to use fire. They are, as of the current census, one of the oldest continuous biological lineages in this sector. Reyes looked at the holographic display she'd opened. The image showed something like a sting ray, if a sting ray had been engineered by a god who was angry at sting rays. 12 meters across at the widest point. Bioluminescent nodes along the leading edge. Eyes that caught light the way deep-water creatures always did, not reflecting it, drinking it. "Old doesn't mean peaceful," he said. "No, the Dravith are not peaceful. They are, however, largely sessile. They nest in thermal vents at depths exceeding 4,000 meters. They have not surfaced in recorded Vethkai history until," she paused, which was not something she usually did, "until 4 months ago." "What changed?" She showed him the next image. It was not a Dravith, it was a ship. Wreckage, technically, spread across the continental shelf in a debris field roughly 2 kilometers long. The materials were not Vethkai. They were not any species she recognized from the Compact registry. "This crashed in the Halos Trench," she said. 11 months ago. The Vethkai government has been suppressing information about it. We believe it is an incursion vessel, a probe, possibly advanced scouting for a larger migration or invasion fleet. The ship contained technology capable of broadcasting on frequencies that Dravith neural tissue responds to. Reyes was quiet for a moment, then, "They're being steered." "That is our hypothesis. Something aboard the wreck, a failsafe, an automated system, something that survived the crash, has been broadcasting a signal that activates aggressive behavior in Dravith. The creatures are moving to the surface. They are attacking coastal settlements. They are, as of 3 weeks ago, attacking any watercraft that enters the archipelago. And you need to get into the archipelago. The Vethkai government has agreed to a summit, neutral ground on the island of Varash. If I can reach Varash, I can negotiate the joint extraction mission that will retrieve the wreck, disable whatever is transmitting that signal, and remove the Dravith from the threat category. He looked at her. If the last 3 diplomatic shuttles sent toward Varosh did not arrive, she let that sit. Reyes looked at the wreckage image for a long time without speaking. He had a way of looking at things that she had not encountered before in a security contractor. He looked at them the way she imagined geologists looked at rock formations, as if he were calculating depth and composition, and the pressures that had produced them rather than just what they appeared to be on the surface. "How deep is the trench?" he asked. 4,200 meters at the deepest point. "And the ship is on the shelf, shallower. Approximately 900 meters. Still out of range for standard intervention." He was talking to himself now more than to her. The signals propagating upward through the water column. The Dravith are responding to something in the transmission, not the source. They don't need to be near the wreck, just in the right acoustic range. He looked at the coast map. "What's the soil composition of the Varosh shelf?" She stared at him. I don't know." "Get me the geological survey, and any data on historical Dravith behavior patterns before the crash, feeding cycles, territorial ranges, seasonal movements." He settled back in his seat. "Also, whatever weapons you have on this shuttle that you haven't told me about yet." Her aide, Tav, a young male who had been holding himself very straight and very far from the human for the entire flight, made a sound of indignation. Sarah raised one hand and he went quiet. "How did you know?" she asked. "Standard diplomatic shuttle," Reyes said. "Weapons-grade hull plating on the undercarriage. Extra fuel cells in the secondary bay, more than you'd carry for a 2-day trip. You're planning for an evacuation scenario." He glanced at Tav. "Also, he's been staring at the emergency panel every 30 seconds since we took off. Whatever's behind it, he's nervous about it." Tav looked away. Sarah unlocked the emergency panel herself. Inside, 2 short-range plasma emitters, a signal scrambler and a single Class 4 depth charge. A naval weapon, repurposed and miniaturized, designed to produce a concussive shockwave underwater. "1 charge," Reyes said. "Okay." "It was the best we could." "It's enough, depending on where we use it." He picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. "Where's the wreck exactly on the shelf, relative to the Varosh approach lane?" She showed him. He studied the map for a long time. Then he said, "I need to swim." "I'm sorry. To get you to the summit, I need to go in the water first. Alone. Before the shuttle makes its approach, I need to be in the water." One of her other aides, Pell, made the Vethkai gesture that approximated laughter at absurdity. "The water," Pell said, "currently contains Dravith." "Yes," Reyes said. He did not elaborate. The island of Tarvok was the last charted stop before the Halos archipelago. It was a supply depot, technically, fuel and provisions for the Vethkai fishing fleet, which had not actually fished these waters in 4 months. The depot was staffed by a single family, an older male named Chovas, his adult daughter Miri, and a nephew of maybe 15 who introduced himself as Trick and immediately asked Reyes if he had ever killed anything. "Several things," Reyes said, and Trick's eyes went wide. They docked at sunset. The water was the color of burnt copper in the low light, and you could see if you looked, if you knew where to look, the faint bioluminescent bloom maybe a kilometer offshore. 2 of them, moving in a slow circle. Chovas watched Reyes watching the water. "You're not going in there," the old man said. It was not a warning. It was the flat assessment of someone who had spent his entire life beside this ocean and understood its current preferences. "Tomorrow morning," Reyes said, "before light." Chovas looked at him for a long time. The Vethkai had 4 eyes, 2 large, forward-facing primary eyes and 2 smaller lateral pupils, vestigial in the fully evolved population but still functional enough to track peripheral movement. Chovas was using all 4 of them now. My wife went in the water, he said. 6 weeks ago, she was checking the hull of our skiff. 30 years she checked that hull. He looked at the copper sea. The thing that took her wasn't angry, it didn't attack. It just moved through her the way water moves through a net. Reyes did not say he was sorry, which Sarah noted. Most beings said they were sorry. She had been about to say it herself. Instead, Reyes said, she was caught in the behavioral field. The transmission makes them treat everything as a competitor. Not prey, a competitor. They don't feed, they eliminate. He was still watching the lights in the water. That's why they're not eating the wreckage. They're patrolling it. That's worse, Chova said. In some ways, better in others. He turned from the water. You have dive equipment. Chovas looked at him. Yes. I'll need the thinnest suit you have, and any acoustic equipment, transducers, hydrophones, anything you use for echolocation. We use them to find fish. I know, I'm going to use them to find something else. He went in at 4 in the morning. The sky was still fully dark. Sarah stood at the end of the dock and watched his light disappear into the water column. A small chemical glow stick he'd clipped to his wrist, green, fading to a point and then to nothing. Her aide Tav stood beside her. He's going to die, Tav said. He said it without satisfaction, which she appreciated. It was just an assessment. He might, she said. Then our mission fails. Then our mission fails. She had said that phrase 3 times in 4 months. The first time, a shuttle had gone down in the approach lane, pilot error or something worse, never determined. The second time, a compact scout vessel had returned with half its crew missing, the survivors in a state her medical staff described as acute neural shock. The third time was a week ago when she had received the formal notification from the Compact Diplomatic Bureau that if this summit failed, the Bureau would recommend military interdiction. Which meant ships, which meant the Vethkai government would interpret it as an invasion even though it wasn't, which meant a war that nobody with any sense wanted. The bioluminescent circles were still moving offshore. She watched them the way she'd been watching everything these past 4 months, the way you watched things when you were no longer sure the world was going to hold its shape. 40 minutes passed. 50. She was beginning the calculations for what happened next steps, contingencies, the cold arithmetic of failure, when a hand came up over the edge of the dock and Reyes pulled himself out of the water. He was not visibly injured. He was not visibly anything. He sat on the dock boards and did not speak for approximately 90 seconds while he controlled his breathing, and then he said, I found the secondary transmission node. Tav blinked. The secondary. The main signal is from the wreck. There's a secondary node, a relay, I think, probably deployed by whatever system is running the wreck's automated functions, planted on the Varos shelf itself. About 40 meters down. That's why the approach lane is so heavily patrolled. The Dravith aren't just responding to the main signal, they're converging on a secondary emitter. Someone set up a kill zone. Sarah felt something cold move through her. Someone, she said carefully. Whoever crashed that ship didn't crash by accident. He was still sitting on the dock, water running off him, looking at the dark water. They deployed a relay before impact. They wanted the Dravith in this specific lane. They wanted anything approaching Varos to be stopped. He looked at her. When was the summit announced? Publicly. She counted back. 9 months ago. The ship crashed 11 months ago. He let that land. They may have known the summit was coming before you announced it, or they knew you'd eventually need this approach lane. Tav made a sound. Pell made a different one. Several of her other aides began talking at once, and she stopped them all with a look. The depth charge, she said, won't reach the main signal, but the relay is 40 meters down, on a shelf formation that's basically a sound conductor. If I can place the charge correctly, the shockwave will propagate along the shelf, hit the relay, destroy it or disrupt it long enough. He paused, doing math in his head. long enough to give us maybe a 6-hour window before the Dravith reorient on the main signal. 6 hours is enough time to get you to Varosh and back. And you would do this how? From the shuttle? No, he said. The shuttle approach will trigger the Dravith response before I can get close enough to the relay. I need to be in the water again. He looked at Chovas, who had been standing at the edge of the dock since Ray's resurfaced. Your skiff. I need it for the approach. A water-level approach will read differently than an aerial one. The relay is calibrated for aerial signatures, I think, based on the patrol patterns. A boat in the water looks like a Dravith to the sensor, too small to flag. Chovas looked at him for a very long time. My skiff, the old man said. Yes. Where my wife died. A beat, yes. Chovas when I get the keys. The skiff was 14 meters long and smelled of engine oil and salt and something else. The faint chemical sweetness of the bioluminescent algae that grew on the hull below the waterline. Trick had been banned from coming by his father, which meant he was there when they pushed off from the dock, standing in the bow's shadow pretending to check a rope. Ray's looked at him, Trick looked back. You're not coming, Ray's said. I know the water, Trick said. I've been diving this shelf since I was 8. You're 15. I'm 16 next month. Still no. I know where the thermal vents run. The Dravith don't patrol over the vents because the turbulence disrupts their lateral line sensors. There's a corridor about 30 meters wide that runs from the outer shelf to the relay position. You don't know where it is. I do. Ray's looked at Sarah. She was not going to make this decision for him. He looked back at the boy. The boy's chin was up and his jaw was set, and his eyes had the particular quality of someone who has already decided and is only now explaining the logic to everyone else. Behind me, Ray's said. You don't move without my signal. You don't surface without my signal. If I signal abort, you go up and you swim for the dock and you do not look back. Understood? Understood, Trick said, and scrambled past him into the bow. The vent corridor was real. Sarah watched from the dock through a borrowed scope. She had insisted on watching, and Chovas had not argued, and she could see the bioluminescent forms circling beyond the approach lane, 3 of them now, moving in that slow, terrible patience that deep-water predators had evolved over millions of years. And she could see the small shadow of the skiff threading between them, impossibly slow, cutting its engine 300 meters out and drifting. The chemical glow sticks on the hull casting just enough light for the scope to track. She had seen security contractors work before. She had seen Vethkai soldiers, compact peacekeepers, private military specialists from 6 species. She had never seen anything like this. It was not dramatic. That was the thing that hit her hardest, watching through the scope. There was no bravado, no visible courage being performed for an audience. Ray's moved the skiff the way a physician moves a scalpel, with the precise minimum force necessary, completely committed, completely quiet. When a Dravith passed within 50 meters of the hull, he went flat on the deck and did not breathe, and the creature's bioluminescent leading edge passed over him like a slow comet and then was gone. She found herself holding her own breath. The skiff stopped. She could see Ray's and Trick at the side rail. Something passed between them, some brief communication, a gesture, a nod. Then Ray's went over the side and the water accepted him without sound. She watched the glow sticks circle the relay site. She watched the Dravith patrol. She watched the 300-year-old volcanic shelf in the blue dark water, and she thought about the diplomat's oldest bargain, that you could talk your way out of anything if you could get to the table. Nobody had warned her that sometimes getting to the table required someone to go into the water alone at night, where something very old and very large was looking for things to destroy. 6 minutes passed, 7, 8. The explosion, when it came, was not what she expected. She had imagined something percussive, violent, a column of water thrown up, a visible shock wave. Instead, there was a deep concussive thud that she felt in her chest before she heard it, a compression that moved through the air and the water simultaneously. And then the bioluminescent lights offshore went dark. All of them. At once. The silence after was absolute. Even the wind off the water seemed to pause. Then she saw the glow sticks at the skiff's rail, and she saw two figures pulling themselves over the side, and she allowed herself to breathe. 6 hours, Reyes said, back on the dock, wringing water from his sleeve. He was speaking to Sarah but looking at Trick, and the look was she could not quite read it, but it was not unkind. Maybe 8 if the thermal vent disruption propagates toward the main signal. We leave in 20 minutes. Trick was grinning in the specific way of someone who has done something terrifying and survived it, and has not yet come down from the biological aftermath. Reyes looked at him, and something passed over his face, not quite a smile but the ghost of one, there and gone. You did well, Reyes said, which was apparently the entirety of what he had to say about it, and Trick's grin got wider by about 30%. The shuttle made the approach lane at dawn. Below them, through the hull cameras, Sarah could see the Halos archipelago spreading across the equatorial sea, 17 islands in a rough crescent, the largest of them Varash, its northern shore giving way to the ancient harbor where the summit building sat. The water was clear and deep, and she could see, if she looked very carefully, the faint debris field of the crashed vessel on the continental shelf. A smear of wrong material in the natural geology, dark against the pale sediment. She thought about what Reyes had said. They may have known the summit was coming before you announced it. She thought about what that meant, not just for this mission, for the next one and the one after. Someone had deployed a relay 900 meters below the surface and set the oldest creatures on this planet to patrol a specific kill zone, not to invade, not to conquer, to prevent a conversation. That was a specific kind of fear, the fear of what two peoples might agree to if left alone together. The shuttle landed on the summit platform without incident. The Varash harbor was quiet in the morning light, the deep-water current moving through the natural channels between the islands in broad, unhurried swells. Beautiful, she thought, and then immediately felt the absurdity of thinking it. The Vethkai delegation was waiting on the platform. Regional Governor Sot, gray-maned and careful, with 6 advisors and a security detail of 12. She had met Sot once before, at a trade conference 3 years ago. He had been cautious then, the kind of cautious that came from a long career of watching people overpromise. He was more than cautious now. He looked like a man who had been awake for 4 months. Ambassador, he said. Governor, she descended the shuttle ramp. Behind her, Reyes moved, not obtrusively, not in a way that would read as aggression to the AI security detail, but he moved to a position from which he could see every sight line simultaneously. She had watched him calculate those positions automatically on Tarvok, in the dock house, in the skiff. He was always doing it. She had stopped finding it unsettling somewhere over the Halo's approach lane. I'm told you had difficulty reaching us, Sot said. Some difficulty, she agreed. We managed. He looked past her at Reyes, at the human in his plain field clothes, water still, watching the harbor. Your security contractor. Yes. We were told you were bringing a human. I was told that concerned some of your advisors. Sot made the gesture that meant it concerned me. The Dravith situation has destabilized every assumption we had about this region. I'm cautious about introducing additional variables. I understand that. She held his gaze. Governor, I need to tell you something about the Dravith situation that you may not know, and then I need to show you something on the shelf survey data, and then I need your cooperation for what comes next. She paused. Because what comes next requires the compact and the Vethkai to do something together that neither of us can do separately. Sot looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Reyes again. Your contractor, he said slowly, he went in the water. Yes. Last night. Alone. With assistance. The bioluminescent disruption we detected at 0300 this morning. Yes. Sot was quiet. His four eyes moved between Sarah and Ray's and the harbor and back to Sarah. He was doing the calculation that she had been doing since Tarvok, the calculation that she suspected she was going to be doing for a long time after this. What was the nature of a species that would do that? Not what tactical advantage it conferred. What it said about the species. Come inside, Sot said, both of you. The summit building was old. Older than the Compact's interest in Verath 4, older than the shipping lanes, probably older than the Vethkai's own written history. It was built from the volcanic stone of the island itself, low and broad, with windows that looked out over the harbor. The morning light came in at a low angle and lay across the meeting table in long bars. Sarah laid the geological surveys across the table. She showed Sot the relay site. She showed him the timeline, 11 months, 9 months, the crash, the summit announcement, the deployment of the relay. She showed him what she and Ray's had worked out in the pre-dawn dark of Tarvok, that whatever had crashed in his trench was not a random event. That someone had chosen this world, this moment, this political negotiation to stop. Sot was silent for a long time when she finished. One of his advisors, a young female who had been taking notes throughout, said, "If the main signal is still active, the relay disruption only bought us hours." Correct, Ray's said. He was standing by the window, looking at the harbor. The Draveth will reorient on the main signal within 6 to 8 hours. After that, the approach lane will be active again. Then we're trapped here, the advisor said. Unless we disable the main signal. The main signal source is 900 meters down, Sot said flatly. We have dive equipment rated to 400. Ray's didn't respond to that immediately. He was still looking at the harbor. Sarah had learned in the past 18 hours to wait when he went quiet. The crash site, he said, 900 meters. What's the composition of the site? What's still intact? Sot looked at his people. The young advisor pulled up a file. We sent a remote probe 6 months ago, before the Draveth behavior escalated past safe operating parameters. The hull material we couldn't identify it. Some of the internal structures were intact. There was evidence of a compartmentalization, sealed sections. We believe some systems are still operational. The transmission system. Yes. Ray's turned from the window. Then you don't disable it from outside. You disable it from inside. He looked at Sarah. The ship crashed on the shelf. 900 meters is deep, but it's not the trench. It's at the edge of the thermal vent system. He looked at Trick, who had come, of course, because that was now apparently simply something that happened, and Trick, who had been very quiet in the corner for the better part of an hour, straightened up. The thermal vents, Trick said slowly, run along the shelf edge. There's a current there, a deep thermal current that rises on the eastern face of the shelf. He looked at Sot's young advisor. My family has fished this water for 4 generations. The shelf current, if you hit it right, will carry you down the eastern face to about 700 meters in approximately 11 minutes, without burning drive at all. The advisor looked at him. You're 16. Next month, Trick said. You can't dive to 700 meters. I know. But if you have a submersible. We have a survey submersible, Sot said, rated to 1,000 meters. We were going to deploy it in the spring. He paused. The Draveth have been sinking anything we put in the water. Because of the relay, Ray said, which is now dark for 6 to 8 hours. He looked at Sarah. She looked at him. This was the part of diplomatic work that never made it into the official records. The part where you looked at each other across whatever table separated you and calculated not whether the plan was safe, because it was not safe, but whether you could live with yourself if you didn't try it. What do you need? Sarah said. The submersible was small and old. and its guidance system had been patched so many times the control interface was essentially a Vethkai navigation system, running on 3 different legacy software platforms simultaneously. The survey crew, 2 of Sat's people, a male named Devet and a female named Por, looked at Rays with the particular expression of people who had been told they were taking a human into the deep water, and had not yet decided how to feel about that. "You've done deep dives before?" Devet asked. "Some," Ray said. "In a submersible." "In worse." Por looked at the hull of their submersible and seemed to feel this was not reassuring. They went in from the eastern harbor mouth. The thermal current caught them 40 meters down, as Trick had said it would, and carried them along the shelf face at a descent angle that felt faster than the instruments suggested. The water darkened as they went, first the bright equatorial blue of the surface, then the blue-gray of mid-column, then the dense blue-black of depth, where the pressure against the hull became an audible presence, a low continuous harmonic that Por told Rays was normal. He believed her. The wreck appeared at 912 meters. Even through the submersible's lights, at the edge of their effective range, it was enormous. Not in the way the crash sites of familiar human vessels were enormous, not the horizontal sprawl of something that had fallen apart on impact. This was a ship that had gone down intact and hit the shelf intact and was still, 9 months later, largely in one piece. Dark material, absorptive rather than reflective, the kind of hull design that said, "We do not want to be seen." "There," Devet said, pointing. A section of the hull near what might have been the forward array was lit from within, a faint pulsing amber light visible through a fracture in the material. Rhythmic, patient. The transmission. Rays looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Sarah's face on the communication screen she'd patched through from the surface. She was watching. He picked up the depth charge. Por looked at it. "You can't use that in here," she said. "The shockwave at this depth, this close to the hull." "I know. I'm not going to fire it remotely." He checked the manual trigger. "I'm going to take it in through the fracture." There was a silence in the submersible of a very particular quality. "The fracture," Devet said, "is approximately wide enough. I've looked at the survey data." He looked at Por. "Can you hold position 30 meters from the hull for a 4-minute window?" "Yes," Por said, and then appeared slightly surprised to have said it. "Good." He looked at Sarah on the screen. She was very still. "If I'm not out in 6 minutes, the submersible leaves. Don't wait." "Rays." "That's an order," he said, and smiled very slightly. "For what it's worth." He went out through the lock. The cold at 900 meters was a different kind of cold than any he'd known at the surface. Not the cold of absence, but the cold of pressure, of everything compressed to its essence. He moved along the hull toward the fracture, the depth charge secured to his chest, the suit's chemical heaters cycling against his core temperature. The amber light pulsed through the fracture ahead. Rhythmic, patient. He had been told during his training, years and a different life ago, that the deep ocean was the closest thing on Earth to outer space. The same crushing silence, the same absolute dark beyond your light source, the same fundamental indifference to your presence. He had thought about that a lot over the years. He thought about it now, pulling himself through the fracture into the interior of a ship that had never been designed for anyone like him, had never imagined anyone like him, had arrived from somewhere that had done its research on this system and its diplomatic timelines and its political pressure points, and had still, apparently, failed to account for the possibility that the sapient species of this sector might include something that would follow it to the bottom of an alien ocean and come through the wall. The interior was a corridor of some kind. Bioluminescent nodes, the ship ran on biology partially, or had been designed to mimic it, lit the space in that amber pulse. He could hear the transmission now, bone conduction, felt more than heard, a frequency that pressed against his teeth and the back of his skull. He could feel why it worked on the Dravith. It was aggressive at the cellular level. It said, "Threat, Threat, threat, all things are threats. He had felt that signal before, in different frequencies, in different contexts. He had a name for it. He moved toward it. The transmission node was in what must have been the forward section, a chamber roughly the size of a transport shuttle, walls lined with the same biological-technological hybrid that seemed to characterize the whole vessel. At the center, a column of amber light, and within it a structure he couldn't name but understood by function. It was a speaker, scaled up, built for water propagation, broadcasting into the planetary ocean from a very long way under the surface. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he placed the charge, set the timer for 90 seconds, and went back the way he came. He was 32 meters from the hull when it went. He felt it first in his spine, and then in his teeth, and then in the water around him, which compressed and then released and compressed again in a series of waves that spun him end over end in the dark water. His light went out. He, oriented by the submersible's beacon, swam toward it in the dark, hit the lock housing with both hands, and the crew had him inside before the second wave hit. Poor was already burning for depth. Devet was on the comms. Surface, this is Survey 2, the charge is set off. We have the contractor ascending now, say again. I heard it, Sarah's voice said through the static. We all heard it. They surfaced in the harbor mouth 40 minutes later. The sky was full daylight now, the kind of hard equatorial light that hit everything without mercy, and the harbor water was quiet. That was the word for it. Quiet in a way it had not been since before the crash. Sarah was on the dock. She watched Rays come up the ladder from the submersible. He was moving carefully. The concussive wave had caught him at depth, and he was carrying the bruise of it through his whole body. She could see it in the way he moved. But he was moving and upright, and he walked to the dock rail and leaned on it and looked out at the harbor. The Dravith, without the relay or the primary transmission, had gone back down. The bioluminescent lights were gone from the surface. The water was just water. Governor Sott stood beside Sarah. He had watched the whole thing from the summit building, the submersible descent, the timer, the detonation, the ascent. He had watched it in the way that leaders sometimes watched events that changed their understanding of the possible. Ambassador, he said, I think we should continue our negotiations. I think so too, Sarah said. She went to Rays. He was still looking at the water. Are you injured? She asked. Bruised, nothing structural. You could have died. He thought about this for a moment. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? She stopped. She knew the answer. She had known it since Tarvok, since the dock in the dark water and the glow stick disappearing, since a human sat in the back of a shuttle and asked her for geological surveys. She had been briefed on humans, of course. The Compact Xenology Division had files. Deathworld Biosphere, the files said, evolved in conditions of active predation, resource competition, climatic extremity. Physiologically unremarkable compared to most spacefaring species. No venom, no natural armor, no extreme sensory adaptation. The files noted this as a curiosity. A species from an environment that should have shaped apex predators had apparently not produced one in the traditional sense. The files were wrong, she understood now. They had been looking for the wrong shape. They had been looking for natural weapons. They had not been looking for the thing that had actually emerged from Earth's long argument with itself. Thank you, she said, for all of it. Rays looked at her. The morning light was very clear, and his scar caught it, and she thought that he was probably tired in a way that went deeper than the dive or the cold water, the kind of tired that accumulated over years of doing this specific thing in this specific way. That's the job, he said. The negotiations took 4 days. Sarah had expected a week, possibly more. The Compact standard diplomatic timeline for first-tier concessions was never less than 5 days. Sott moved faster than that. She thought it was because something had shifted in his calculation of what was possible, which was not unrelated to watching a human descend alone into 900 meters of alien ocean with a depth charge. The joint extraction mission was agreed on by the second day. Compact resources, Vethkai jurisdiction, shared data on whatever they found aboard the wreck. The Dravith, with both signal sources neutralized, had retreated to their thermal vents and were showing no surface aggression. The biologists on both sides were very excited about this, which Sarah found mildly irritating and chose not to examine too closely. On the final morning, before the shuttle departure, Trick found Rays at the harbor wall. Sarah watched from a distance and did not overhear it because she had some sense of what it was and felt that it was private. Later, Trick told her that he had asked Rays how you became the kind of person who went into the water when the water was that. And Rays had said, "You don't become it. You find out you already are it." Trick had thought about that and said, "That sounds scary." And Rays had said, "Yeah, it is a little." On the shuttle back, somewhere over the equatorial sea, Sarah sat across from Rays and looked at him for a long time. He met her eyes. "The compact xenology files on humans," she said, "describe your species as physiologically unremarkable." "I know," he said, "we've seen the files." "They're wrong." "I know that too." "What should they say?" He looked out the window. Below them, the Halos archipelago caught the afternoon light, each island a shadow in the bright equatorial water, the sea itself, once more, at least for now just the sea. "You know those vent corridors," he said, "the ones Trick knew. The ones the Dravith don't patrol, because the turbulence disrupts their sensors." "Yes. We spent about 4 billion years figuring out where all the corridors are." He looked back at her. "Every planet, every ecosystem, every designed kill zone someone builds, there's always a corridor. We got very good at finding them." He almost smiled. "That's probably what the files should say." Sarah thought about that for a while. Then she thought about the 4 months of failures that had preceded this mission. The shuttles that hadn't arrived. The relay in the dark water, patient and old, broadcasting threat into the bones of an ancient species. Someone had built a very careful kill zone. Someone had studied this system, this political moment, these diplomatic lanes, and had done their homework. And none of their homework had included a human bodyguard asking about geological surveys at 4 in the morning. She looked at Rays. He had closed his eyes. Whether he was sleeping or thinking or simply doing that thing she had noticed him doing, that conservation of attention, that deliberate stillness between actions, she couldn't tell. She thought, "I hired a human because I needed someone willing to go into dangerous water." She had not fully understood what that meant until now. Outside the shuttle window, the sea was blue and ordinary and completely calm, and 40 meters below its surface, the thermal vent corridors ran in their ancient patterns, and the oldest creatures on the planet rested in their trenches, and the kill zone's relay sat dark and broken on the shelf, and somewhere in the deep water, the wreck of something that had made a very significant miscalculation about this system lay open to whatever came next. She made a note to update the compact xenology files on humans. She had several suggestions for what they should say. 3 months after Varash, the joint extraction mission recovered the wreck's forward data core intact. The compact's analysis team worked on it for 11 days before they had a partial translation. The ship had not been a scout vessel or an advance probe. It had been, as best the analysts could determine, a diplomatic suppression platform, a specialized vessel deployed by a species the compact had no record of, designed specifically to prevent first contact negotiations between emerging civilizations and the larger galactic community. The wreck's log contained records of 17 such deployments across 4 different systems over what appeared to be a span of several thousand years. All 17 had succeeded. Sarah read the analysis report on a Tuesday morning in her office on the station. She read it twice. Then she filed a formal notification with the Compact's diplomatic emergency channel, and while waiting for a response, poured herself something to drink. On the 17th page of the report, in a section detailing the wreck's sensor logs from the final hours before impact, was a notation from the analysis team. The wreck had detected the Tarvok skiff on the water at approximately 0300 on the morning before the summit. Its automated systems had made an assessment. The notation read, "Sensor contact evaluated as non-threat. Small aquatic surface craft, no aerial capability, no detected energy weapon signature, likely biological in origin." No countermeasures had been deployed. Sarah read that 3 times. Then she called Reyes. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been awake, which at this hour meant he was somewhere doing one of those things that men like him were always doing somewhere that she had stopped trying to inquire about because the answer was always something that would have alarmed her if she'd had less context. "The wreck's automated system saw the skiff," she said without preamble, "evaluated it as non-threat, took no countermeasures." A pause. "Of course it did," he said. He sounded like he was smiling. "It was a wooden skiff, built by a Vethkai fisherman, running dark, 3 people who didn't read like a strike team at any frequency it was designed to monitor." Another pause. "A species that's been suppressing galactic diplomacy for 1,000 years and has 17 clean, successful deployments on record. What are they watching for? Militarized vessels, energy signatures, organized military force." "Right," his voice was even. "They're watching for what they'd send. They're not watching for what we do." She thought about the corridor in the thermal vent system, the one that ran below the Dravith patrol range, 30 meters wide, usable by something small enough and quiet enough to thread it. She thought about 4 billion years of evolution in an environment that would kill you in 100 different ways, and what kind of problem-solving instinct that produced. "The Compact is going to want a formal debrief," she said. "I figured. They're also going to want to know if you're available for a follow-up mission." The analysis team found coordinates for the other 16 deployment sites. A longer pause. "Are any of them underwater?" he asked. She checked the report. 3 of them. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, I can do that." She set down the report. Outside her office window, the station turned slowly against the stars, and somewhere in the system below, in the deep water of a world that had almost been kept from the conversation, the oldest creatures on the planet rested in their trenches, and the corridors ran where they had always run, and the galaxy continued its ancient, complicated business of trying to talk to itself. "Reyes," she said. "Ambassador. The Xenology files. I've put in the revision request." She paused. "I cited you specifically as a case study." "What did you write?" She looked at what she'd written. "Physiologically unremarkable, strategically unprecedented. The species has developed, through a combination of environmental pressure and cultural practice, a category of tactical response that has no direct analog in the Compact's existing threat and capability assessments. They identify corridors. They use them. They do this in the dark, alone, at depth, without requiring external validation that the corridor exists before committing to it." She paused. "I also wrote, do not mistake quietness for absence of capacity. The most dangerous thing a human does is go still." A long pause on the line. "That's pretty good," Reyes said. "I thought so," she said, and ended the call. Outside, the stars were very bright and very old and entirely indifferent, and far below in the dark water, the corridors ran. The debriefing happened at Compact headquarters, a station in the middle belt of the system, politically neutral in the way that things were neutral when everyone agreed they were too tired to fight about it. Sarah had been through 14 formal debriefings in her career, and this one was different from the others in a way she didn't identify until the third hour. In the others, she had been the expert. She had explained the situation, and the people in the room had listened and asked questions that allowed her to explain further, and eventually they had arrived at a consensus understanding. It was the rhythm of institutional knowledge transfer. This time, the people in the room kept asking her about Ray's. Not about the Dravith, not about the crashed vessel or its 17 deployment record, or the 3 Vethkai crew members who had gone into the water with him. They asked about those things too, but they always came back to Ray's. How had he assessed the relay position from surface acoustic patterns? How had he identified the secondary node without prior survey data? How had he known the depth charge shockwave would propagate along the shelf formation rather than dissipating into open water? She answered as well as she could. She had asked him these questions herself in quieter moments. The shelf was volcanic, he had said when she'd asked about the propagation calculation. The rock is dense, old, crystalline. Sound travels differently through that kind of formation than through sediment. I've worked in similar geology before. Different planet, different ocean, same physics. When she'd asked about the secondary node identification, the patrol patterns, if the signal was coming from one source, the Dravith would have shown a radial distribution, spread out from the main site. Instead, they were concentrated in the approach lane specifically. You don't get that from a single point source. You get that from 2 signals creating an interference zone. I just needed to find where the signals crossed. And when she'd asked, this was after the debrief, over something hot and bitter that the station's kitchen called coffee and Ray's called a reasonable approximation. How he'd known the skiff approach would work. How he'd known the wreck's automated systems would classify them as non-threat. He had looked at his cup for a moment. I didn't know, he said. I thought it would probably work. I thought the logic was sound. He looked up. There's a difference. I've met people who claim to know things like that before they happen. They're either lying or they've confused confidence with certainty. That distinction doesn't seem to have slowed you down much. No, he agreed. But it keeps you honest about what you're betting. She had thought about that answer for 3 weeks. The debrief panel included, on its 7th and final day, a xenologist named Preth who specialized in human behavioral analysis. Preth was Vethkai, part of SOT's delegation, added to the compact committee at SOT's personal request, which itself said something about how the summit had changed things. She was in her middle years, methodical, with the particular intensity of a scientist who has just had a foundational assumption challenged. The problem with our behavioral models, Preth told the committee, with Sarah in the room and Ray's in the room and a recording running for the official archive, is that we built them from observable biology. We looked at human physiological specs. We looked at their homeworld's threat profile. We modeled the evolutionary pressures and derived the predicted behavioral outputs. She paused. Our models predicted that humans would demonstrate elevated threat response, aggression under perceived danger, pack coordination instincts, and strong in-group protection behaviors. Those predictions weren't wrong, someone on the panel said. They weren't wrong. They were incomplete. Preth pulled up a display. The relay did not detect the skiff as a threat. This is correct. The relay was calibrated to detect the behavioral signatures of organized military coordination. Compact warships have a specific electromagnetic profile. Military dive teams use predictable tactical patterns. Even improvised strike teams show recognizable coordination behaviors. She looked at Ray's. The human showed none of these signatures. He used a civilian vessel, moved at low speed on the surface, carried no detectable weapons until he was inside the hull of the target. Ray's said nothing. He was watching Preth with the mild attention he brought to most things. What the relay was not calibrated to detect, Preth continued, was a threat that did not recognize itself as a threat. The human was not performing a military operation. He was solving a problem. She turned to the full panel. This is the gap in our threat assessment models. We evaluate species' capability by their weapons, their formations, their military doctrine. We do not have a category for a species that goes into an active kill zone, carrying a single explosive device, and a geological survey, because the geological survey told them there was a corridor. That's a very narrow case, one of the panel members said. It is not, Preth said. The historical record from the recovered data core shows 17 successful suppression deployments. In every case, the species being suppressed either deployed military response, which the platform's countermeasures were designed for, or did not respond effectively at all. No case in the record involves what happened here. She paused. Irregular access, unconventional vector, single operator, low signature approach. Intimate knowledge of local geography acquired in real time, rather than prior intelligence. Those are tactical advantages that any species could theoretically employ, the panel member said. Theoretically, Preth agreed. The question is which species would, which species defaults to this approach, which species, when presented with an environment that is actively trying to kill them and a problem that requires someone to go into that environment, produces an individual who finds the corridor and uses it. She set down her data pad. Our models assume that the death world evolutionary pressure would produce a species optimized for confrontation, for direct engagement with threats. We were looking for the apex predator in the traditional sense: strength, weaponry, aggression. Silence in the room. What Earth produced, Preth said, was something more specific. It produced a species that is comfortable operating in environments where everything is trying to kill them, and has therefore developed the cognitive habit of looking for the gap in the killing rather than trying to overpower the killer. She looked at rays again. They are not the apex predator. They are the thing that found a way to live in the same world as the apex predators. Rays said, "That's not quite right either." The room looked at him. "We are the apex predator," he said, simply and without particular emphasis. "We just don't look like people's model of one." Because the thing at the top of a death world food chain isn't the biggest or the strongest or the most aggressive. It's the one that's still there after everything else has had a shot at removing it. He looked at Preth. Your model assumed the pressure produces a specific type. What it actually produces is flexibility. We're apex because we filled every niche. We're the deep-water predator and the corridor finder and the pack hunter and the ambush specialist and the tool user and the endurance predator and the problem solver, all at once, in the same individual, depending on what the environment requires. He paused. That's what 4 billion years gets you. The room was quiet for a while. Preth looked at him, the way scientists looked at something that had just rearranged their taxonomy. On the last day before her rotation leave, Sarah found herself at the station's observation deck, which looked out over the lower planet, Verath 4, blue and green and ordinary from this distance. The kind of planet that looked peaceful from space, the way all planets looked peaceful from space. The complexity of what lived in them invisible at this remove. She had been thinking about the thing Rays had said to Trick. You don't become it. You find out you already are it. She had been a diplomat for 22 years. She had negotiated in bad rooms and good ones, under pressure and without it, with species she understood and species she was still learning to read. She had been afraid, genuinely afraid, many times afraid of failing, of the wrong word in the wrong moment, of the agreement that seemed correct but contained a flaw she hadn't seen. She had lost negotiations. She had lost people. She had never been afraid the way she'd been afraid watching Rays disappear into the water. She was examining that standing at the observation window. Why that specifically? He had been in danger before, she'd understood that intellectually. But this had been different. Something about watching a living thing descend into a pressurized killing environment with one explosive device, and a plan that depended on the local geological survey being correct. She thought she understood it now. It was the same fear she felt in negotiations. Not fear of physical harm, fear that the plan would fail. that the calculation would be wrong, that the geological survey would not say what he needed it to say, or the depth charge would not propagate correctly, or the relay would turn out to be deeper or better protected or differently calibrated, or the Dravith would appear in the thermal vent corridor at the wrong moment. Fear of the gap not being there. He had gone into the water without knowing if the gap was there, with a strong belief that it was, with a geological survey and a 16-year-old's local knowledge, and 40 years of instincts shaped by a planet that had spent 4 billion years arranging things to kill him. He had gone in because the gap was probably there. She had spent 22 years in negotiations. She had made arguments she wasn't certain of, accepted terms she'd assessed as probably workable, committed to frameworks she believed were sound without being able to prove it. You couldn't wait for certainty. Certainty was what happened after you'd already made the decision and found out you were right. Before that, you had assessment and probability and the willingness to commit to probably. She had not, she realized, fully understood until Tarvok that she and the human bodyguard were in the same profession. Rays appeared beside her at the observation window. She had not heard him come in, which no longer surprised her. "Thought you were leaving today," she said. "Shuttle's in 3 hours." They stood together at the window. Varath 4 turned below them, slow and blue and indifferent. "Preth's report is going to change things," Sarah said. "For how the Compact thinks about human contractors, there'll be more requests, more missions like this one." "I know. Will you take them?" He looked at the planet. She watched him think. "Probably," he said. "The ones that need what I do, not all of them. I'm not a military asset." "No," she said, "you're not." She had learned over the past weeks how important that distinction was to him. He was not a weapon to be deployed. He was a person who was very good at finding corridors, and he chose, apparently, to use that in specific ways and not in others. She didn't fully understand the line he'd drawn, but she respected that he had drawn it clearly. "The 3 other deployment sites," she said, "the non-underwater ones. I'll be the lead diplomat on at least one of them, possibly 2. "I know. I'd like you on those missions." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said, "okay." They stood in silence for a while. Below them the planet turned. 3 or 4 of its 17 archipelago islands were visible at this angle, small dark shapes in a bright equatorial sea. From here, you couldn't see the Halo's approach lane or the harbor at Varash or the shelf where the wreck lay open and being catalogued. From here, it all looked calm. "What was it like?" Sarah asked. "Inside the wreck?" He was quiet for a moment. "Dark," he said. "The transmission felt," he paused, looking for the word. "You know the way alarm calls propagate in a predator environment. The warning signal that says danger, danger, everything is danger. It felt like being inside that signal. But you kept moving." "The signal didn't apply to me," he said simply. "Whatever they built it to activate, it wasn't my biology." "You were still in a dark room at 900 meters with one explosive device." "Yeah," he almost smiled. "That part was less comfortable." She laughed. It surprised her. It had been a while since something had made her laugh without any effort at all. He looked briefly startled, and then his expression eased, and she thought, "This is what it looks like when someone who is usually very guarded decides something is safe enough to let in." "Go catch your shuttle," she said. "Yeah," he picked up the bag he'd set by the door, paused. "Ambassador." "Rays." He looked at her for a moment. "For what it's worth, you held the dock while I was in the water. You stayed and you watched. That sounds like nothing. It isn't nothing." She thought about standing on the Tarvok dock in the dark with the bioluminescent circles offshore and the glow stick fading into the water column. She thought about what it had felt like to watch and wait and not be able to follow. "I know," she said. He nodded once, then he was gone. She looked back at the planet below. The station turned slowly, and the light shifted across the observation glass, and she remained there for a while, thinking about corridors and the species that found them, and the kind of diplomatic work that happened on the other side of equations that everyone else said were impossible. The galaxy was very large and very old and full of things that had been trying to stop the conversation for a very long time. She intended to keep having it,